In today's world marked by uncertainty, I want to begin by highlighting what is certain. And I especially believe that this is something worthwhile, being said here, that knowledge is the most valuable resource an individual can possess. The knowledge I gained here enabled me, less than 10 years after graduating from Oxford, to become the president of a nation. And this is a message of hope I send especially to the young people here and throughout the world, and the confirmation that they are in the right place. Today I wish to speak about the tectonic shifts shaking the foundations of the world politics, the emergence of an international order where rules increasingly give way to rulers, and where we are witnessing a sweeping global redistribution of power unlike any we have seen in many decades. I will place a special emphasis on small states, on how they can navigate this complex landscape with wisdom and courage, and obviously with a particular reference to Montenegro and our own foreign policy priorities. I'm certain you all know the story by Jonathan Swift. And actually, yesterday I was in Dublin. And you may all know that Jonathan was the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, who wrote a story about the English sailor, Lemuel Gulliver, who after a shipwreck found himself on the shores of a land inhabited by the Lilliputians, the small people, the miniature people. And it is precisely these Lilliputians that I will speak about today. Because as you may know, Robert Keehan, the American political scientist, once famously observed, if Lilliputians can tie up Gulliver or make him do their fighting for them, they must be studied as carefully as the giant. The history of international relations is, at its core, the history of power. From ancient civilizations and medieval empires to the Westphalian system of international relations and the delicate architecture of the balance of power back then in Europe, to the Cold War and the multilateral order that followed. It has always been the power of the states that determined the fate of the world. And whether we are prepared to admit it or not, the multilateral international order with the United Nations at its center, though the greatest achievement of the liberal vision of the international relations ultimately rested on the power and resolve of those states willing to defend it. And when those states decide they will no longer bear the burden, what follows is a very turbulent redistribution of power and a restless search for a new equilibrium. And that, dear friends, dear colleagues, is defining the time today. And what role then do small states play in such an emerging order? Going back to the story, when Gulliver awoke on the shores of Lilliput, he discovered that he was bound by countless thin cords, so many that he could not move. And each thin cord perhaps represents one small state today in the international system. Each tie forged between them is a guarantee of mutual protection and shared interests. And only by weaving these dense networks of cooperation can small states become a real and stabilizing force within a very uncertain global order. And this is indeed how Montenegro, a small state, understands its strategic priorities. And those are to stand as a credible and reliable member of a wider NATO alliance, to become the next full member of the European Union, and to act as a consistent actor within the United Nations system, regardless of its imperfections. And I'll speak of them later on. So despite its size, Montenegro has committed to increasing defense spending to 5% of our GDP, aligning our policy with the strongest members of the NATO alliance. And this is not a simple adaptation. It is a statement of principle and a firm commitment to Euro-Atlantic values. It is willingness to shoulder responsibility in very uncertain times. Montenegro's membership in NATO is significant for at least two fundamental reasons, which are bigger than Montenegro. The first one is, it is the strongest guarantee of our national security, but also the one which provides the stability for a wider region of the Western Balkans. And this is a very important for the very reason which can nicely be summarized in what was a quote supposedly by the former British Prime Minister, Churchill, who said that the Balkans produces more history than it can consume. The second reason is the one which represents a decisive step on our part towards a full membership in the European Union family. And as a matter of fact, as you may know, every single country from Central and Eastern Europe which entered the EU first was admitted into NATO. Moreover, at a time when fragmentation dominates global discourse, let me remind you that with Montenegro's accession in NATO back in 2017, the eastern coast of the northern Mediterranean became part of the same political and security community for the first time since the division of the Roman Empire, which happened in the 4th century, in 395. And for centuries after this division between the East and the West, the coastline was a divisive line between the powers, between the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire, between the Ottoman Empire in the East and the Habsburgs in the West, between the Allied powers and the Central powers in the First World War, between the Allies and the Axis powers in the Second World War, and between the non-aligned movement and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. So after more than 1,600 years, that reality changed. And that fact speaks volume. It reminds us that certain alliances must never be underestimated. At the same time, the full membership in the European Union remains Montenegro's strategic objective. As the most advanced out of 10 candidate countries that are currently there, we are within reach of this historic milestone for our country. And I firmly believe we possess everything required and necessary to become the 28th member state of the European Union by 2028. And in this context, we are confronted with 4 different scenarios from the lenses of the European Union enlargement process, each carrying a lasting consequences both for the Union as well as for the candidate countries. The first scenario is the one which I call stagnation without recognition. A candidate country fails to use the accession process to advance democratically, to advance institutionally, to advance economically, and the EU withholds recognition. And the outcome, from a wider perspective, is a clear loss, both for the Union as well as for the candidate country. The EU is left with incomplete democracies at its borders, while the candidate country remains deprived of the benefits of the membership, with forces of de-democratization gaining ground. Predictably, this is the scenario most welcomed by the opponents of the European project, who seize the opportunity to expand their influence in Europe. The second scenario is the one which I call progress without accession. A candidate country genuinely invests in its institutional reforms and democratic standards, yet accession does not follow. History shows that this often leads to frustration, regression, and the erosion of hard-earned democratic gains. And in the long run, this is a lose-lose scenario for both the Union and the candidate country. And think of the case of the North Macedonia, the country which even changed its name and as a result had no major EU accession progress which followed. While a few nations may still manage to consolidate stable, rule-based democracies, experiences teaches us that such outcomes are very rare. So this brings me to the third scenario, and this is the one of accession without a genuine reform agenda. A candidate country demonstrates insufficient democratic progress, institutional progress, yet is admitted by the European Union primarily for certain geopolitical reasons. Though some advocate this approach, regardless of reform performance, it is ultimately unsustainable. While it may appear to satisfy both the EU's enlargement momentum and the candidate country's ambitions, particularly regarding increased development funding, the long-term cost can be severe. Core values such as the rule of law and effective governance and democratic standards are compromised. And moreover, this scenario creates a very good ground for adversarial actors to project their own influence once again within the EU. So this brings me to the fourth and final scenario, which I call the win-win part. Both sides deliver. The candidate country uses the EU accession process to achieve genuine democratic transformation, to build resilient institutions, to safeguard media freedom and pursue sustainable economic development, and is then welcomed into the EU fully prepared. And this is truly an optimal outcome, one that ensures shared growth, resilience, and long-term stability and prosperity. It is the only sustainable path forward from the lenses both of the EU as well as of the candidate country. And this is precisely the future I envision for Montenegro. So we must seize the EU accession process, this powerful external anchor to accelerate reforms and strengthen our democracy, ensuring that we join the European Union not merely as a new member, but also as a fully prepared one. Montenegro's accession to the European Union would have far-reaching consequences, well beyond our borders. It would encourage other countries and send a very clear message. Reforms and a democratic political culture do pay off. Let me bring to you another perspective. In the more recent history, Montenegro became internationally recognized as a sovereign country following the Berlin Congress of 1878. And over the last 150 years, since then, after the rule of the two dynasties, one which was from Montenegro and the other one which came from Serbia, followed by decades of the rule by the communists following the World War II, and the first formally multi-party but relatively unfree elections, which happened following the fall of the Berlin Wall, won by a reformed Communist Party that became the longest governing successor of a Communist Party in any of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, a genuine democratic change, and the new political culture came only as a result of the elections in 2020. And instead of becoming yet another case worldwide of democratic backsliding, Montenegro has emerged as an example of democratic progress. And here lies the second very great role of small states in the international order. At critical moments, small states can become catalysts of regional and even wider global transformation. Montenegro has demonstrated this more than once throughout our history. In 1912, Montenegro was the first Balkan nation to declare war on the far more powerful Ottoman Empire. And it was followed by Serbia, by Bulgaria and Greece. And soon after, the landscape of Europe was changed. The Ottoman Empire lost all its European territories. And after centuries of Ottoman dominance, the political landscape of the Balkans, as well as of a wider Europe, was genuinely transformed. On July 13th, 1941, the first and the largest anti-fascist uprising in occupied Europe erupted in Montenegro. Soon the entire territory of the former Yugoslavia, just at the beginning of the World War II, rose in resistance. And 4 years later, it was liberated, not by the Soviets, but by the people of Yugoslavia. And this is how Yugoslavia ended up to be a non-aligned nation rather than part of the Soviet bloc. And in that moment, Montenegro proved yet again that freedom is defended not by size, but by determination. So history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, as you know Mark Twain has put it. Montenegro today stands as the most advanced candidate country for the EU accession, and once it joins, enlargement will not end there. This is an opportunity not only for Montenegro, but for the European Union itself to demonstrate that it remains an active, attractive, and transformative global leader. Here finally I come to the third priority of Montenegro's foreign policy, and indeed of all small nations around the world: responsible engagement and cooperation with other countries within the United Nations system. We all know that the United Nations is not perfect. But one thing is certain: the world, as we know it, would be a far worse place without it. So whenever you question the relevance of the United Nations, remember the context of its birth. Rising from the ashes of the Second World War, the United Nations emerged as a beacon of hope for humanity. And everything in this world must evolve and improve. So after 80 years of shared achievements, it is a real time to reform the United Nations, to prepare it for the challenges and opportunities of the future. So criticism of the United Nations does not reflect solely the organization itself. It reflects on all of us, its member states, the big ones as well as the small ones, because we all have an equal voice. We are the ones who created it, guide it, and bear the responsibility to strengthen it. To conclude, small states may not be able to restrain the giants. Sometimes we can replace them, just as Montenegro will replace the United Kingdom as the 28th member of the European Union. Sometimes we can slow them down. And sometimes, in slowing them, we shape the very direction in which they move. So we do not need giants to wage wars against Belfascu or any other imagined enemy. We need them to confront the real enemies of the world, and those are climate change, poverty, epidemics, and the unpredictable consequences of technological change. And in a world where power is increasingly decisive, small states must respond with coordination, consistency, and responsibility. And with this, Montenegro will act with resolve, confident in its values and the course we have chosen. Thank you very much.